Hey, this is Gunnar and you're listening to the Below the Surface podcast. Before we dive into this episode, I have a brief community announcement to make here. Once or twice a year, Southern Cross University hosts an acid sulfate soil assessment professional short course. It's a 2-day course. Held on the Gold Coast, and I can honestly tell you it is awesome. No, we're not being sponsored, but I truly think this is a great course to participate in. It's held by Nick Ward and Graham Lancaster. They are all co-authors of the 2018 National Acid Sulfate Soil Assessment Guidance. It's held again on the 20th and 21st of November 2025. If you have time, please go and attend that course. It's a fantastic course. Link to it is in the show notes, or you can just Google Southern Cross University Acid Sulfate Soil course, and it'll take you straight there. That's that. Now for this episode of the Below the Surface podcast, I have my co-host here, James Hammond. How are you going?
Good, thanks. And I'm hopefully sounding a lot better because you got me a flash new headset.
Yeah, you have a decent microphone finally.
That's it.
Hey, a really quick intro because ultimately the guests are going to introduce themselves. We have spoken on a few episodes now that New South Wales Health has released a health advice on PFAS. That health advice is quite spectacularly different than what you would expect to say. James, have you heard about the forever chemicals, how horribly toxic they are, and if we keep doing it, how we're all going to die?
Yeah, I have. And I'm self-confessed not an expert in PFAS. It's probably one of the contaminants that I'm not very well versed in. I have seen the movie Dark Waters, though. I found it to be very entertaining and very interesting. I'm a consumer of the mainstream version of PFAS, I would say.
Yeah, which is funny because I'm not a consumer of mainstream media at all. I many years ago, I stopped listening to the news. What do you do to keep up? I don't need to keep up. Things come across my desk. Now, PFAS stuff does come across my desk, of course. And I too have had the opinion like, hey, this is something, it's an emerging contaminant, and we really got to be careful here. So out comes the New South Wales Health PFAS health advice. And here's the one line that actually sums it up very, very nicely. Point 1.1. The panel recommended the body of research for health effects related to PFAS is large and still growing. We all know that. Based on substantial research already undertaken, the health effects of PFAS appear to be small. Now, that sums it up. This is an easy to read health advice. I link to it in the show notes. But this health advice is full of these kind of quite spectacular statements and spectacularly blunt. So I read that and I'm like, oh, come on. How can that be that there is hundreds of millions of dollars of research out there and there's New South Wales Health comes up with a completely different result?
Yeah, because it goes against the grain of the trend that is happening in everything else. So in the PFAS NEMP, in the drinking water guidelines, in all the other resources that we have, the tolerance for PFAS and related compounds is declining and going down. And you've got the ICAMS regulation where you're regulating this stuff from getting into products. So it's against the grain of everything else.
That's right. That's exactly right. And when something like this happens, so when something goes against the main body of research, you're usually talking about cranks. This is the electromagnetic sensitivity guys. It's the it's the homeopathy dudes. It's the wind farm noise proponents. That kind of these kind of kooks who think, oh well, there's a massive conspiracy here and nobody knows the truth except for us. Of course, there's a few select people. So you and I, we did a fair bit of research on this one. There seems to be a trend. We're actually researching our episodes. We managed to get a hold of quite a few people, some of them risk assessors, and we looked into this. And we also jumped on via their media email, and we applied for an interview with some panel members. And, lo and behold, they said, sure, we have some people who are happy to talk to you. And today we're talking to Professor Martin Kirk and Claire Hooker. They introduced themselves. And it was completely eye-opening what these guys had to say. We had not a lot, but we had quite some email exchanges beforehand where I outlaid exactly what I said. It's like, hey guys, when I read something that controversial, it really usually comes from
not a respected source.
Not a respected source, right? These are non, the anti-vaxxers is another one of those groups, right?
Yeah.
And you know what, to their credit, they fully understood. They completely understood my argument, but my point of view.
Yeah.
And my God, were they generous with their time, generous with their understanding of our points.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely loved this interview. These two are so impressive.
Yeah, me too. And I walked away with just a total new appreciation of what the current status is around PFAS and why we are regulating the way we are and the reasons for us approaching it in the way we are.
Yes. So here we go. Here they are. You're in for something. One very important thing, listeners, this is an episode you really need to listen to. You need to actually concentrate on what Claire and Martin have to say. It's not that easy to follow it all because there's a lot of information that they present. But goodness, it's a good one, and I'm very proud of this episode. There you go. Martin, this is Hammond. James Hammond.
Hello, James.
Hi, Martin. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you.
Claire, I love your background.
Hi, Claire.
How are you?
Thank you for your generous emails and for the time that you spent with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
No problems at all.
So my Zim background, which I think you commented on, is a painting by a quite well-known Aboriginal artist from a very remote desert region. And it's actually called Bush Medicine. It was a donation to my school.
Wow.
Amazing.
When you Google you two, it's just the abundance of links is what can I say, humbling for me. Claire, you specialize in values and ethics in arts and health.
Yes. And
that already kind of is a separate podcast we almost need
to have. It's a separate podcast. It doesn't belong in a conversation about PFAS. But
no.
Very happy to talk about that any day of the week.
And then it also says you are a specialist in risk communication. And I'm thinking, oh boy, good luck with that one, because science communication is already tough. But when someone needs to communicate risks, somehow I always find that as humans, we have a bug. It's not a feature. It's a bug where we are just terrible in assessing risks. And you are a risk communicator. When I read this, I'm thinking, oh boy, that's a tough gig.
Yeah, and it is a feature in the same way that AI hallucinating is a feature and not a bug.
Okay. See, now you're already going sideways. I need to know, why do you think that humans' bad understanding of risk is actually a feature?
Because we have a huge amount of research dating back to the late 1960s and early 1970s that demonstrates that human perception of risk is strongly shaped by cognitive shortcuts that support rapid assessments. But at the same time, it's very well known that they introduce systematic biases in appraisals of situations that are uncertain. And so that is quite systematic. It's relatively reproducible across a wide variety of contexts, including amongst the people with the highest degrees of science literacy. So they show exactly the same features outside their areas of expertise. So that's why I say it's a feature and not a bug. It's a part of human cognition.
Okay. That I agree with. When you call something a feature, it is hard for me to understand that someone who doesn't assess risk properly actually has an evolutionary advantage, though. I mean, that's what I would consider a feature. Am I wrong? I mean, this is the last thing I ask you about this.
I was thinking about how hallucinations are regarded as a feature of AI rather than a bug, meaning they occur because of the way the AI is constructed. So therefore, it will hallucinate. It's part of how it works. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking of it in that way. If you like, we could call it an affordance or even a disposition. So that is that it is part of the way the processing works, it confers certain advantages. A lot of the time, the rapid appraisal is accurate enough times to be useful. So it works for us, but it comes with this cost.
Okay. All right, let's talk PFAS.
Just before we jump into the main meal, Claire and Martin, do you mind just giving us a bit of a background on yourselves, but then also just give us the background on the health expert panel and how it came to be and what its role is now and going forward?
No worries. All right. So my name's Martin Kirk. I'm a professor of epidemiology at the Australian National University. I spent about 20 years working in government before I moved over to the university sector in 2011 after having completed Masters and PhD in epidemiology. My main area of work is in food and waterborne infectious diseases, but I started out life as a chemist, didn't work in a lab very long, worked in a health department dealing with chemicals and water. At some point, about probably 10 years ago, the Federal Health Department approached my team to do a study of the health effects of PFAS in 3 affected communities in Australia. So with that backdrop, we did the study. The reports are on the web. There's been continued debate about the health effects and how bad PFAS are for humans. They're clearly environmentally persistent. So the New South Wales Department of Health assembled a panel of experts with a wide range of backgrounds, everything from risk communication, which was Claire's area of expertise, right through to epidemiology, clinical pathology, general practice, clinical toxicology. And the panel was asked to deliberate on the current knowledge around PFAS. And if people look in the literature, it is very confusing because you'll find there are studies saying, yes, it has this health effect. And then the next study in a similar context say, no health effects. And so it's very difficult for the uninitiated to interpret, and even experts disagree. So the panel, they were presented with evidence from some updated reviews, and we were asked to look at different aspects of the potential health effects right through to clinical assessment and treatment, because we had quite a number of clinicians on the panel as well. The expert panel made its findings available, and they're on the internet along with the minutes of the meetings and other supporting information. I don't think there's any plan to continue it. It was really just to look at the current level of evidence and certainty around PFAS and health effects.
Right. Okay. So there's no scheduled revisiting of this at this point. It's just this is the point in time, information we have, and then when it needs to be revisited in the future, it can be.
Yeah, and there had been previous efforts to look at the health effects of PFAS. So the federal government had established a health panel back in around about 2018, I think, just prior to the studies that we conducted. It came up with fairly similar conclusions. You know, there's a huge volume of health literature around the potential effects of PFAS, and some of it's more convincing than others. It's not all bad, but I think it is difficult to interpret for the uninitiated.
Well, I read the health advice, and it is such a relatively easy to read document. It has 11 pages, but a lot of them are references as usual in a technical summary. But the panel makes some amazingly blunt statements, amazingly blunt for an official government release, let alone for a technical, it's not a paper, but for a summary like that. I just quote a few of them that I immediately highlighted. One of them is, there are inconsistent findings across different studies. There is limited evidence of a dose-response relationship. The studies are unable to distinguish any effects of PFAS from many other factors that can affect health. Many studies cannot adequately control for bias and confounding, and chance may play a role in the findings. These are brutal comments that you make there. And the question, of course, then immediately arises, hang on a minute here. So for the last 3 years, I have been bombarded with messages coming from the mainstream media, whatever that is. It reaches, of course, my desk because Google has figured out I'm in this industry. So, I mean, there is just everything that I read is just horribly, horribly dangerous. That's the impression I get. Then I read the NEMP 3, the National Environmental Management Plan for PFAS, number 2 and number 3 has just been released. And we have, oh my God, we had to reduce the amount of PFAS that we allow in drinking water from 70, I think, to 8 parts per trillion. That's something that rolls easily off somebody's tongue. I always have to tell people 8 parts per trillion is 8 seconds in 32,000 years. Just for people to understand how small these amounts are that we are looking at here. Whether we can even reliably sample is yet a completely different question that I always throw out. So you guys come along and you say, hang on a second, if I paraphrase now, well, that's all nice and good. We have worldwide studies and there's the Stockholm Convention, and I'm sure they have reviewed all this, and there has been hundreds of millions of dollars spent on PFAS research. And from what I gather, right, on my end, from what we read is this, oh my God, PFAS is just horrible and terrible. And, 8 parts per trillion is in drinking water, which is nothing. And then you guys come along and say, well, wait a minute, all these studies, they shouldn't be making those conclusions that they are making. Or even, I'm not so sure if you say that, but it could also be interpreted in what makes it into the public is not what those studies say. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of points I'd like to make. Firstly is that I think the big tragedy of PFAS is their environmental persistence.
Yeah.
They end up being bioaccumulative in humans and animals and the environment, and that's certainly something we want to minimize. So regardless of whether there's any health effects, we should put that on the table. The second thing is that we have these chemicals in our bodies because of the fact that they've been ubiquitous in consumer goods, and it was the demand that drove these chemicals into our homes, so through Teflon and Gore-Tex and anti-stain and anti-stick compounds. And so I think that's the starting point. The health effects are far more difficult to discern. And it's what I was saying to you. If you actually go and look at epidemiological studies, you will actually see that they do not have good evidence of dose response. And you would think that that was really important if you were going to say one thing caused another.
That's the thing that counts.
Yeah. And, and they really don't have good evidence of dose response in the main. There are some studies which probably do, like there's thousands of studies, as you point out, on every biological system known to man. There's been lots of them. And this is something Claire might want to comment on. What we see in the scientific literature and what we see in the public domain are different things. And it kind of suits the narrative to actually say these are cancer causing, we've got to get them out of the environment, out of the drinking water. But when we look at the epidemiological studies, they're not particularly convincing. When you look at animal studies and other types of basic science, there is some evidence of effect, but it is nowhere near as strong as what you would believe from, the public debate and the newspaper headlines. We see stories where there's a cancer cluster in township where there's been PFAS. But when we go and look at the data, they're all different types of cancers.
Yeah.
And the population is getting older, and the rates are no higher than comparison communities. And it's just our perception. It's, as Claire was talking about before, perception of risk. Humans are often terrible at that. They overestimate or they underestimate, and they rarely get it right. So I'm not saying that the communities are wrong, because we have to listen to communities and what they get concerned about. We know that these slow-moving environmental disasters have a dramatic effect on social cohesion and well-being in these communities. So I'm definitely not making light of that. But I think it's easy to conduct studies and inadequately controlled for confounding. For instance, smoking is a key cause of cancer, but many studies looking at exposure between environmental contaminants like PFAS, where you live, you're exposed, and cancer in a registry, but you may never talk to the people. and you may never understand their smoking history,
Mm.
which could be a confounder, could be related to socioeconomic factors, which also encode for your likelihood of being exposed to PFAS or your occupation.
Can I ask a question about that as someone who really doesn't know much about epidemiological studies? I mean, how is it that a study designed like that is kind of taken seriously when there are so many variables that aren't being accounted for?
It's a good question, but we've seen the rise of epidemiological studies using large population databases where, say, for instance, when we did the PFAS health study, we had 3 communities, Williamtown, Oakey, Catherine. We assembled a geographic cohort of people who'd ever lived there. So we did that by linking Medicare data back files going back to 1980s with the cancer registry. And then we also did the same for some comparison communities, which were matched on age, sex, Indigenous status. And then we looked at outcomes of cancers and other causes of mortality. We can't get any other exposure history. They're registry-based studies. And I think if you look in the literature, you'll find that we and many other people who analyse those don't make grand conclusions out of those studies for that very reason. We can assume that the potential confounders like smoking and alcohol and other lifestyle factors are balanced between our communities and the comparison communities, but there's no guarantees. And I think we're quite guarded about that. And that's why I think coming along and saying one thing causes another is quite complicated. And it's rare that single studies would ever have a role in causation, saying something causes another. It's usually based on an amassing of scientific knowledge.
Yeah. And so is it fair to say that there are other environmental contaminants where the dose-response relationship has been clearly established, and that for PFAS it's just a bit more difficult? Is that right to say?
Yeah. Well, look, I think if you look at many causes of cancer, like say if you look at benzene or asbestos, the higher the level of exposure, the greater your likelihood of developing cancer. And that's not the case for PFAS. Cancer being one outcome, there's many, many others that have been studied.
Right.
So, for example, we know lots about the negative effects of exposing children to lead.
Yes.
This is a really nice sort of classic, they're straight up and down, nothing to debate here study where you can be quite clear that the exposure leads to a consequence.
Yeah.
In the world of public health, when we're looking at outcomes like cancer and heart disease and also things like stroke, the overwhelming drivers of those things in the population are not environmental exposures. They are lack of physical activity, drinking too much alcohol. It's a small set of lifestyle factors and really importantly and crucially, your postcode and socioeconomic status. Those are the things that drive those outcomes. And so an environmental contaminant or pollutant would have to have a really powerful effect to notice its influence on top of those drivers. Because those drivers are absolutely, it's not even comparable, the degree to which they're the ones that cause those things compared to other things. Martin, do you find my statement accurate?
Yeah, it's good. And I think it's many health effects like cardiovascular disease, cancer, multi-causal, and these other lifestyle-related factors and genetic factors are the key drivers. They're really strong, and you can see them epidemiologically. You go and look at rates of smoking or physical activity, you can actually see dose response.
That is such an interesting comment you just made, Claire, that I have never thought of it that way. But is a comparison comes to my mind is when you're standing on near a busy road and the noise is very loud. For something noise-wise to have an impact, it has to have a certain level of noise that you can even notice it. So it's the same with something like PFAS. To distinguish whether that actually has a negative health effect, it would have to overcome the most obvious ones, being smoking, being overweight, being a lack of physical exercise.
Drinking alcohol.
Yeah, that's another good one. How come I didn't mention that? But nobody really likes to hear that. when I remember what caused James and me to start this podcast was, in fact, the unbelievable nonsense that went on about a year and a half ago in Sydney because we found some bonded asbestos in mulch. And everybody loses their mind about it. In fact, there were voices that we need to cancel the Mardi Gras because there were some fragments of asbestos found in the park down there. And I am, of course, thinking, hang on, guys, here. There's a bunch of pieces of bonded asbestos lying there. And that's one thing. And you are trying to cancel a public piss up where we know the health effects of alcohol. Let's not belittle that. That is a definite known carcinogen. Let's not even talk about the social impact that drug has, right? We know how terrible it is, and you're trying to cancel it because there's a couple of pieces of asbestos lying around. That is what I was talking to you right at the beginning, just such a failure of evaluation of risk by not only the public. You can forgive the public, you can forgive them because the public is not necessarily scientifically educated, and they need to believe what they are presented by the media and by government, right? And that's why I have a huge gripe with, I'm going on a rant here, with the New South Wales EPA, with the way it was handled.
Presented, yeah.
Right.
It takes me to this point that I'm really interested in, which is about how a person's autonomy affects their perception of risk. And I think it's to that point where, people obviously willingly take in alcohol. There's a level of choice there that you don't have when an environmental contaminant is forced upon you through other mechanisms. So, Claire, are you able to comment on that and just how that autonomy factor comes into how people perceive things?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, to respond to Gunnar, it's interesting that you framed that you reach for this particular analogy because early risk communication literature drew very much from cybernetics and from sort of early communication studies and does talk about signal and noise, literally. And there's a framework called social amplification of risk, which imagines that a risk is a signal and that various factors can amplify it. And hence the task of risk communication may be to amplify it or to attenuate it, depending on the degree to which it matches or doesn't match its technical hazard assessment. So I just wanted to comment on that. That's explicitly often the way the task of risk communication is conceived. In those well-established factors from psychometric studies about what amplifies risk signals or amplifies perceptions of risk, there's just heaps of data that shows that people perceive risks as lower if they consider that they're in control of them and perceive risks as higher if they perceive they're not in control of them. The classic example there is the huge number of people who are worried about flying but happy to drive their car, even though they're so much more likely to die in their car than they are to die in an airplane. It also is potentially explanatory of why we see such a huge influence of trust on risk perception. If you can't control something directly, you presumably have to place your trust in whatever the mediating agency or person is who can or who will have that control. So if you have lower trust, then risk perception typically is greatly heightened. And then if we take a situation of involuntary environmental exposure, that adds one more step or dimension of that. So again, typically risks are perceived as higher if they are involuntary or coerced rather than voluntary. And perhaps relatedly, if they are perceived to impact on women and children rather than the population at large. And unfairness is identified as a separate factor, but I think it's related to that cluster of concerns. So yes, so you would expect that people are likely to be more concerned about risks to which they have experienced an involuntary exposure. And that might go some way to explaining some of the high levels of concern around some environmental risks that whose hazard assessment is much smaller in terms of actual impacts on people's health. And PFAS might well fit that context. And Gunnar, just while I'm speaking to these points, in preparation for this, I did go and revisit media in very reputable outlets in Australia. So it's the ABC and the Guardian. They're the sort of, most reputable mass media publications that would be known for attempting to do a good job of science communication and, have responsible journalism and be well informed by expertise and so on. And like you, I had noticed the degree to which my sort of takeaway impressions from reports in those outlets differed from the discussions that I was experiencing within the expert panel. I went and had a look at a recent article, very recent article in the ABC. When I looked at it really carefully, there were actually very few points of difference. What was different was the framing. So, as you say, the overall framing might be we're anxious to ensure that we don't have ongoing, long-lasting environmental exposures. So we're going to talk about the potential risks and hence the importance of continuing to revise guidelines and in a way that is on the path to the elimination of PFAS, that the right direction of travel is towards the elimination of PFAS. But that's actually on the basis of more like precautionary principles and concerns about the unknown effects of long-lasting, ongoing existence than driven by, the kind of data that told us that smoking causes lung cancer. It's not because of a clear dose response known health outcome. It's because precaution ought to be the basis on which we can act. But I agree, it leaves the impression that all we're doing is placing emphasis on risk and hazard that seem then to make the New South Wales health advice look as though it is at odds with the coverage. But when I actually looked at any of the actual statements from any of the experts quoted, there isn't a point of disagreement that I could clearly identify.
That's so much to unpack here. You mentioned that risk is perceived higher when there's a lack of trust. Do we need to say that science in general lately has taken a hit for whatever reasons? They are internal in Australia, they are external from Australia, but trust in science has taken a dive. Trust in public health policies has taken a hit. Suspicion has risen.
Certainly since the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a whole lot of things involved, but I think mis and disinformation has a big part to play. I think getting back to the involuntary nature of exposure, that does raise people's anxiety significantly. We did a study a few years ago on Mr. Fluffy insulation in the ACT. They bought these houses in good faith. Lots of them didn't even know they had asbestos insulation and they were remediated. Then ACT government comes along and buys them back, but many people just have a huge sense of distress and anxiety about that process and feel really aggrieved. It's quite staggering, when we heard all the stories and we heard about people that wouldn't even let their grandkids come over and visit. Really quite terrible stories, and they just make things so much worse on top of the actual risk, which might be relatively small, and it is with mesothelioma. It is raised, but still a very low probability of becoming ill.
This is taking me to that point around the mental health impact and the sort of how that manifests physically in the body as well. And so I found it a really interesting point that the panel made in the report, that the way that this is presented, and the information the sources people have, is that it has a great effect on their mental health. And I would imagine teasing out the physical effects of that on people is difficult when you're compared to the acute or sort of secondary effects of the chemicals themselves. Are you able to just to comment a little bit more on that, about the mental health aspect of all this?
Yeah, in the PFAS health study, we did actually do focus groups to understand people's experience of living in these communities. We also looked at measures of psychological distress of community members in surveys. Both of these showed a high level of anxiety and distress in these communities. I don't think it's necessarily difficult sort that out from the actual health effects of a chemical. I think as epidemiologists, we're really looking for diseases that have fairly well demarcated sort of criteria. We can distinguish that, and we can do that with biochemical markers and look at, say, cholesterol and its relationship to PFAS. But I do think the psychological effects of these slow-moving disasters is really huge. It's important to point out that there were many people in these communities which never engaged with us and may not have felt the same. And we did hear stories of people just wishing that all of this would end, because what it did to property values and values of businesses and other things is substantial.
Yeah, I find that really interesting, just the relationship between anxiety and stress and other disease. It is a consideration whenever we're talking about risk of environmental contaminants that you do need to walk the line a little bit, and you don't want to overstate things to the point where you are scaring people unnecessarily.
Yeah, so in the area of risk communication, we talk a lot about building sustainable public trust. And the word sustainable is indicative of the fact that science changes. That's what science should do. Science is an innovation machine. It is there to make things change. We're dealing with hazards where the uncertainties are often, significant. So we should expect that we're not going to make the right decisions all the time, and that our advice is going to have to change at some point. So you want sustainable public trust that can accept the fact that you need to revise your position, and that revising your position is the responsible thing to do. Now, a key component of sustainable public trust is transparency. So that leads us to this dilemma. There's often a lot of concern about not wanting to provide too much information in case the public misinterprets it and in case it raises anxiety in a way that's inappropriate. The general view in risk communication is that communication is a dilemma. It's never going to be perfect for everybody. And so you're always going to be, if you like, in a situation where any communication approach may have benefits for some, but potentially some less beneficial impacts for others, at least in the short term. But our view is that it's always better to be open and transparent, even if it means tolerating heightened anxiety for a time, because that is much better than people feeling like they don't know what's going on and they can't trust you because they're filling in the gaps of what it is they're imagining happens. And can I just say that governments and most organisations are really terrible at this. They are always so anxious about trying to control how the public behaves when they absolutely would get better outcomes by respecting and trusting the public to come with them, by being transparent and clear about reasoning and the information on which their pronouncements are based. So it's a little bit of a soapbox for me. I've seen the things go much worse when it's the other way round too many times.
A lot of the time we don't have the full picture. Like there's obviously a lack of clarity around this, right? About what the health impacts actually are. To what extent should authorities and governments be telling people what they don't know, in terms of transparency and respecting people's?
Yep. It's clear advice that's been in risk communication studies for decades. Say what you don't know as well as what you do know.
Right.
To the extent that you can, often you have very constrained opportunities for saying something, but it's really important to acknowledge as much as you can clearly. Doing it in practice is always tricky. The expert panel spent a lot of time wordsmithing the advice document that you received. And I'm really proud of it. But it was a collective effort that took a lot of thinking about, does the phrase land well this way or that way? Does it accurately capture how we think this is the most accurate way of understanding this? Is it open to misinterpretation? Mostly people don't have the resources of time and expertise to have that process. So I'm very sympathetic about the difficulties in doing what I just airily suggested.
Yeah, and I think that what Claire's suggesting about bringing the community along the journey is relatively simple with something that, like asbestos, where it's got a very clear relationship with mesothelioma. Virtually nothing else causes mesothelioma, a terrible cancer, but it's very rare. But when you've got PFAS, it has this huge amount of epidemiological studies. Many of them are unclear. I mean, if you look at all of the 10 to 15 systematic reviews for PFAS and cancer, 10 to 15 that have used all the same studies, they've all come up with the conclusion that there is not much evidence that PFAS causes cancer. Yet the International Agency for Research on Cancer comes out and declares PFOA a human carcinogen and PFOS a possible human carcinogen. But if you read the fine print, it says that they did that on the basis not from epidemiological studies, but from animal studies and mechanistic studies. So it's sort of saying, well, we've seen that PFAS potentially has immunological effects, so therefore it could lower your immune system response and thus give you a higher likelihood of developing cancer. So it's not based on human studies. The human studies don't show you definitively that PFAS causes cancer.
Those lists of cancer-causing substances and potential cancer-causing substances, what I really loved in your health advice here was, okay, it's been categorized as a cancer-causing substance, but so is alcohol, shift work, and wood dust.
And red meat.
Red meat. Can I add aloe vera and some others onto the aspartame and Diet Coke? It is so important that we keep this in perspective here.
Yeah.
And I made notes here while you were talking, Claire, because you say scaring people, but I tell you what, science communicators are fighting such an uphill battle because scaring works.
Yeah.
Scaring people works.
Yeah. And people selectively attend to negative information.
Of course. And there is huge interest that people get outraged and get scared about a subject rather than informed and calmed down. It's just, I don't know if it's human nature, another one of those bugs and not a feature, right? That we enjoy scandals much more than calming voices. Also, when you said science changes, that is for scientifically minded people. That's an obvious thing, and it's one of the greatest advantages of science is that it does change, right? Science moves with evidence. However, you tell a politician, the first thing a politician is never, ever change your mind. It's perceived a weakness. The opposition or your counterpart will instantly jump on that, call it a backflip and flip-flopping, doesn't know what he's talking about. She always changes her mind. That's a good thing.
Or the other thing is government can never admit mistakes.
Oh, God forbid.
And,
yes.
Mistakes are actually where we learn, but government's really not allowed to. And so I think that shapes a lot of our public discourse about risk.
Mm.
Indeed. But I would like to say two things. One is that on the one hand, I was wanting to make the point that transparent communication is always better than not transparent communication. So it's always better to be transparent and not to hide things just because you're scared of how the public will react to them. Having said that, how you communicate those things is really important because you do know that there will be undue selective attention to negative factors, and that will be potentially create long-lasting distortions that we have lots of concerns about. So at this juncture, though, I want to emphasize that the same perceptions of risk have been shown in multiple studies to operate in people with the highest science literacies as well as of lower science literacy. So this is not a problem of lay people not understanding science. This happens in scientific communities, and it happens in scientifically literate communities. And there's an exception there, and the exception is outside people's areas of expertise. I just want to make sure that we understand this as a social phenomenon that's not a simple phenomenon that can be fixed with, for example, better science education. I wish that were so. I'm sure better science education helps, but it only helps in the context of high quality public discussion about how to proceed. It might be worthwhile also, just while we're on these points, touching on the question of blood testing, which
yes, please.
the expert panel did not recommend occur. Having thought about it really carefully, the expert panel could not find any indicators that the numbers you get in a blood test tells you anything meaningful, nor could it contribute to building an evidence base. It's because a non-random small selection of people who are worried enough to get a blood test in a community just will not be able to demonstrate an effect over and above those lifestyle and socioeconomic drivers that we talked about before. The main evidence did not concern cancer, it concerned elevated cholesterol. And you can get a cholesterol test any day of the week and take whatever actions you like with your provider to reduce the risks that might attend high cholesterol, and you won't ever be able to identify what your high cholesterol was caused by. But what we can say is that in a community, the causes of high cholesterol from lifestyle factors and socioeconomic factors are going to hugely obliterate any tiny signal from PFAS, even if one exists.
One of the reasons why you may not want to do widespread blood tests are because, first of all, the evidence is not here. Elevated PFAS levels in blood actually do have negative effects. That's the first thing. And the second thing is we do very much know that people worrying about it is at this stage still way more harmful than the slightly elevated levels of PFAS. But boy, that is hard to communicate to anyone. Yeah. And I commend you for doing it in that health advice.
It's also very expensive. It's about $500 per test. It's not listed on the Medicare benefit schedule. And when a doctor gets a PFAS blood test and has a patient in front of them, giving credible advice about what it means now, what it means next year, and what to do about it is really difficult. And we know that community members do want blood tests in places where there's been known contamination. It's just very difficult to justify it.
And we did feel that, there are lots of other contexts in public health where we worry about over-testing. Again, actually, the principle of sustainable public trust means that New South Wales Health will always make the judgment based on the best evidence available. And the evidence was very clear that the test results cannot tell anybody anything useful about what they should do for their health over and above what they would do anyway with their GP. I completely understand that people would feel like getting my test and getting my results would give me a bit more of a sense of being in control because then I have my access to my information. But actually, that only applies if the information has any meaning. And the number they're going to get back tells you nothing about their future health. My understanding is actually not only does everybody in the population show some level of PFAS due to the ubiquity of the exposures, but actually overall population PFAS levels have been falling. And they've been falling because over the last few decades, people have slowly regulated on the basis of the precautionary principle without any evidence of an actual health outcome to limit PFAS exposures. So the reason why an environmental exposure in the community is judged as a small risk is partly because we have such good regulation in place and we're moving in a direction of travel that limits exposures in general. These kinds of exposures, therefore, don't show you elevations that are in any way extreme. So I think that's another hard thing to get one's head around.
We've had about a tenfold decrease in blood PFAS levels in the last 20 years, which is really quite substantial. And it really comes back to probably not so much regulation, but actually industry not using these chemicals and swapping them out to other kinds of chemicals. So PFAS have been swapped out. And, it does beg the question, like, what else is there that we don't yet know about that's also environmentally persistent? And I think, there is that vector looming over the discussion as well.
Gunnar and I were having a chat with some other colleagues the other week about the point, and when we spoke to the CEO of the EPA recently, he made a comment around his desire for I guess like a green list of safe chemistry. And my question from that was like, I think it's a great goal, but do we know enough about how certain compounds will react with body systems to predict what those effects will be ahead of time? My understanding is that maybe we're not quite there yet, but I'll go back to your point you made very early on, Martin, which is that we can at least look at the principles around this stuff, which is PFAS compounds are bioaccumulative, they're persistent, they don't break down in the environment, there's a range of other effects they have. And so in principle, those kinds of features of these chemicals are probably not that we want to be promoting. Is that am I right in saying that for starters, that we're not quite there yet to predictive ability for new compounds?
I think we're definitely not there yet in terms of being able to predict it. I mean, the vast array of chemicals that are in use in consumer goods and households, we're unable to do that. We might be able to in the future. Who knows? We might be able to predict the behaviour of chemicals using artificial intelligence based on their relatedness to other types of chemicals. I do think we should be trying to reduce exposure to chemicals that actually are persistent in the environment, just on the basis of precaution alone. That's probably the sum total of it.
Because let's face it, most of the real nasties that we know about now, let's name them, lead, a clear one, benzene and associations with petroleum hydrocarbons is another one, smoking, alcohol, asbestos. These are the ones that we know of. And they all started off with, hey, nothing to see here.
Yeah.
Only then for us to later find out, hang on a second, this may not be the world's greatest idea to have, to use lead as a makeup because it makes your eyes shiny. This may not be good. Or, leaded petrol, it makes engines run so smoothly. But hang on a second, what's this with neurotoxicity? Really? I mean, it all started off harmless in saying, there's nothing here. So maybe our approach to introducing new chemicals, we should rethink that.
Maybe, but I do think there's a distinct difference between those chemicals and PFAS is that if we use the same methods to study those other chemicals as we have PFAS, we can see an effect.
I think it's one of the better examples of regulation or management of PFAS and applying the precautionary principle. On the other side of this, they're highly useful compounds that are found in a range of, like you said, consumer goods and other materials and applications that are very useful. And there's a massive industrial and economic weight that comes with that. And so to see these compounds regulated where there are multiple lines of evidence that they should be regulated and reduced, but perhaps none of them individually are being that strong. It's actually one of the better examples I can think of, because often it's very, very difficult to shift industry away from something, even when there is a clear association. Like we just have to think about the things that Gunnar has mentioned, or, that we've been talking about, smoking, phasing out of asbestos. Those things were very difficult to do.
Yeah, agreed.
Can I ask you both to give me a summary message for those who don't want to read it, or for those who it's too technical? Give me a TikTok-like like summary. Hey guys, we think that's the takeaway message. That's it. That's what we want to get out there. Martin, do you want to start?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think for me, the takeaway message is that it's clear that PFAS are environmentally persistent and they have caused great concern for communities where there's been environmental contamination. The expert panel reviewed the health information that was available currently, and it is very mixed. And so we think that there's not really a basis for having blood tests because they don't give you information on any health diagnosis or any future health diagnosis at the moment. There's not enough science to enable us to do that. We also reviewed the health effects, and we feel that what health effects there was evidence of are likely to be very small. And by that, we mean that they might increase cholesterol a little bit, but it's not noticeable when you consider all of the other important factors that are responsible for raised cholesterol, like lifestyle factors.
Clear. TikTok summary.
My key takeaway is that it is possible to be very concerned to continue to limit the use of particular chemicals, in this case PFAS, in consumer products and in the environment on the basis of the precautionary principle alone. And in that context, to be very attentive to the studies that identify potential harms that might result from their accumulation in either animal or human bodies. So it's possible to be really committed to that view and at the same time understand that at present the evidence suggests that the risks to human health from the environmental exposures that have occurred in Australia are actually quite small. So those two things feel contradictory, but actually they can be simultaneously true and not in contradiction with each other.
Nice. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. You have no idea how appreciative we are for you coming here and talking to us. James and I spent a considerable amount of time researching, talk to risk assessors. What I was trying to do is I was trying to find a risk assessor who says, "Oh, well, whoa, they obviously didn't read this or that paper, and now you need to shoot at them that." But whatever we did in researching this, we found out, you know what? Any expert completely agrees with your health advice. There was no one we talked to said, "Yeah, well, oh my God, one-sided, lopsided."
That's reassuring.
It's quite amazing. So I was like, well, I don't know, what are we going to talk about here today? Because I was hoping for some controversy that we could at least clear up. But amongst the experts, there isn't one.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And again, Claire, your background is the best. It is so neat. It is so beautiful.
Well, my other hat is arts and health. So all I'm going to say is, boy, it's a pretty cheap trick to just reach for some great art.
Guys, thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely talking to you both, James and Gunnar. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt.
Bye, guys.